Buongiorno, sono Marco. Vi informiamo che potete seguire l'appuntamento in diverse lingue grazie a un servizio di supporto alla comprensione simultanea realizzato con intelligenza artificiale, accessibile direttamente dal vostro cellulare. Vi chiedo qualche secondo per spiegarvi come funziona. Per prima cosa, prendete il vostro telefonino e inquadrate il codice QR che vedete nel video. In questo modo potrete scaricare sul vostro cellulare l'app di Interprefy con cui viene gestita la traduzione. Vi lascio ancora un secondo per inquadrare il codice QR. Dopo aver scansionato il codice QR, si aprirà la app. Scrivete nel riquadro al centro la password che vedete qui e fate tap sul bottone con la scritta Connect in basso. Si apre così la vostra schermata operativa. Facendo tap in basso a sinistra, sulla scritta English indicata dal riquadro, si aprirà una schermata che vi permette di scegliere l'audio della lingua di preferenza, inglese o italiano. Usate le vostre cuffie e ascoltate o la lingua originale o la versione tradotta dall'intelligenza artificiale. Facendo tap in basso a destra, sulla scritta CC indicata dal riquadro, invece potrete scegliere di attivare i sottotitoli e leggere la trascrizione della lingua originale o della lingua tradotta con l'intelligenza artificiale. Per uscire dalla app sarà sufficiente far tap sul simbolo in alto a sinistra indicato dal riquadro e poi cliccare su Leave. Vi faccio vedere ancora una volta il codice QR per accedere alla app. La traduzione con intelligenza artificiale è in continuo sviluppo. Vi invitiamo a usare questo servizio per contribuire a migliorarlo. Grazie.
Benvenuti al Festival della Green Economy di Parma. Sono qui per presentarvi la 16ª edizione del festival. Come evidenzia il titolo di quest'anno, analizzeremo le grandi trasformazioni economiche, sociali e ambientali che segneranno il pianeta nei prossimi 20 anni. A partire dagli effetti del riscaldamento globale e dell'inverno demografico, ci porremo alcune domande decisive. Quali prodotti e servizi sarà necessario sviluppare per rispondere ai nuovi bisogni della società? Come potranno le imprese ridurre le emissioni di CO2 e gli impatti ambientali grazie alle nuove tecnologie e a processi produttivi sempre più innovativi? E quale ruolo avranno le nuove generazioni, chiamate a guidare un cambio di paradigma come consumatori consapevoli e futura classe dirigente? È questo il filo conduttore dell'edizione 2026 del Festival, che si articolerà in 15 grandi eventi e in 7 sezioni tematiche di approfondimento, dedicate a esplorare le sfide e le opportunità che diversi settori si troveranno ad affrontare per rendere la sostenibilità un pilastro strategico su cui costruire il futuro delle imprese e della società. Da venerdì a domenica, Parma ospita 250 relatori, protagonisti di numerosi eventi e della 4ª edizione del premio Green Book. Nell'area talk allestita nel cuore della città, in piazza Garibaldi, infine trovate uno spazio libri con tutti gli autori del festival e alcuni titoli per approfondire i temi della sostenibilità. Prima di dare il benvenuto agli ospiti del prossimo evento, a nome dei promotori del festival, vorrei ringraziare i copromotori e i main partner. Grazie anche ai partner che, assieme ai contributor, hanno sostenuto questo progetto. E infine grazie ai patrocinatori, ai media partner, ai partner tecnici e al nostro Green Partner. Un ringraziamento va anche ai 100 studenti delle scuole superiori di Parma che ci aiutano in questo fine settimana. Un'ultima nota. Ricordatevi anche di controllare il programma aggiornato degli eventi su greeneconomyfestival.it. Buon ascolto e buon festival!
Good afternoon, everybody. As you have already comprehended, we are talking in English today. We are here with Sanderson, former Financial Times journalist, an expert on commodities, raw materials, and also an expert on China. He was telling me that he lived in China for 7 years, so he knows the country quite well. He's the author of Bolt Rush, a book that we translated in Italian. You can find it here in the little bookshop. In Italian it's Il prezzo della sostenibilità, vincitori e vinti nella corsa globale all'auto elettrica. The title of this event is Geopolitics of Raw Materials, which is kind of large as a theme, so we will try to stay on the more important and also more actual themes. The first one, I think, is the relationship with Africa. We were talking about the relations between USA and Africa and what's happening right now. What we know is that Africa is rich of minerals, and we're seeing some nationalism surge across the continent. Some countries in Africa have tightened their grip on mining assets or even banned raw exports. So the question is, what's happening in Africa, and is it finally moving from being a raw material donor to other countries to becoming a real strategic player in its own right, or is it just an illusion?
No, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming along to this talk on Saturday afternoon. It's a great opportunity to be here and talk about these topics, which are becoming ever more important, much more important than when I wrote my book. So we've got enough time. It is a big topic, but we've got enough time. So first of all, Africa. And, Africa is one of the key regions for raw materials. It's very rich in a lot of minerals. And this is everything from copper to platinum, lots of different minerals. And really, what is so extraordinary over the last 10, 15 years, pretty much the Chinese mining companies were without competition in Africa. And they acquired some of the best deposits right across Africa, and not in any sort of nefarious means, often quite willingly. So an American company sold a Chinese company the best copper cobalt deposit in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2016, because the US company was having problems, was being targeted by a hedge fund. So they sold this fantastic asset to a Chinese company. That's one example.
Maybe they didn't see what was coming back then.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about it, but the Chinese can pay more often. They think about these assets in different ways. And another big reason was ESG. Obviously ESG is good, but the downside of it over the last 10, 15 years was mining companies became very risk averse, and they were very scared of any risks of corruption, risks of environmental or social, in risky countries like the DRC. So we saw a lot of big mining companies just withdraw from Africa. Companies that had decades of experience withdraw from Africa. So the Chinese really acquired a lot of assets: lithium, cobalt, copper, and there's good reason. China, as everyone knows, manufactures the bulk of global products, so it needs so many minerals. It's import dependent on a lot of minerals. So fast forward to today, so what we've seen with the Trump administration is a much more proactive, even aggressive reverse of this trend, and they're really trying now to secure more minerals in Africa by very aggressive means. I was telling you just before that in Zambia, the US has threatened to withhold HIV medicine unless Zambia opens up its minerals to US companies. So the mindset of the US now is, China has secured all these minerals. These countries better give them to the US now, or else. And we don't quite know how this is going to work out, and we can go on. But that's essentially what's happening now. The US is being much more active and aggressive.
And how are African countries reacting to this? What are they doing? Are they trying to take rights on what they own, or so have they changed approach or not?
Yeah, sorry, the last part of your question. It's really interesting. What we're seeing at the moment is resource nationalism is rising, and it's a really, really interesting moment because China is very import dependent on a lot of these minerals. So last month, Zimbabwe effectively banned exports of lithium from the country and said you've got to build more processing in Zimbabwe to produce a higher value lithium product, so Zimbabwe gets more money. And it's a big shock for China because they rely on imports, as I said, so the price went up. There was a lot of confusion in China about what this actually meant. But essentially, these countries have leverage, Because if you think about China produces most of the world's batteries, this is a key economic sector in China for Xi Jinping. Clean energy, manufacturing, they can be held hostage by a shortage of minerals. So a country like Zimbabwe, which you wouldn't think of having the sort of power to stand up to Colossus like China, actually has quite a lot of leverage and is using it to say, you better build a bit more value in country rather than exporting essentially a rock with 6% or lithium to China. So what I think is going to be really interesting to see is how far can resource-rich countries push it? Because obviously, if you take it too far, China could say, well, we'll just invest in Mali or somewhere else. So it's a delicate balancing act, but I think these resource-rich countries have a real strong point, which is we need some greater benefit. We see the energy transition, we see the demand for batteries, we need some greater benefit. And China, it's really interesting because China faces a fundamental conflict, which is they need access to resources, but they don't want to export their technology, their know-how outside of China too much. They want these industries in China, the processing, the manufacturing. So they don't want to lose that, but they know they have to give a bit more than just importing raw materials.
Do you think this could be a real weakness on China's model? We were talking before about Trump's moves to contain China and make sure that it doesn't just win the competition. And you were telling me, well, it's not really working what Trump's doing in weakening China, but this seems to me like a big weakness. So do you think it could really affect China's growth, or are we going too far?
Yeah, I mean, every country has vulnerabilities, and China, it wants to be an autarky as much as possible. It doesn't want to be reliant on the rest of the world, but it fundamentally is. You've got export reliance. They're massively reliant on exports because they've built up so much production capacity. As one Chinese company said recently, like, unless we export, we die. So they need foreign markets, and then they need imports of certain minerals and commodities, so obviously oil and gas, but there are some minerals that they just don't have at home, like copper is one example, platinum. Brazil is the biggest producer of niobium, so they need that from Brazil. So they rely on imports. From Myanmar, they get more and more rare earths, which they need. So they're very vulnerable because their entire industrial machine relies on these imports. So if these countries all got together and said we're not going to supply China, of course that is a concern. But I think they're not so worried about Trump because Trump's strategy is fundamentally illogical. And I say that because he's being very strong on critical minerals. We must secure this. We must get Greenland. But at the same time, he's killing a lot of domestic US manufacturing. So battery manufacturing has really suffered in the US. Manufacturing jobs, I think, have actually gone down, which is kind of unbelievable, right? That's the very thing he wanted to campaign on, was bring jobs back, bring manufacturing back. He's really destroyed a lot of industries because he doesn't like electric vehicles or he doesn't like wind power. So I think China's not too worried because at the end of the day, you've got to have someone to use the minerals. You can't just dig up the minerals and what are you going to do with it? And China really dominates that whole industrial supply chain. So until the US and Europe actually build up big supply chains, then China's not worried. But saying that, something like rare earths, which obviously is small, yes, I think the US, Japan, Europe are getting more aggressive, and potentially in 5-10 years, maybe China will have less leverage.
So what do you think that the US should do to really, make sure that China has limits in its dominance? Is there something that they could do that could work outside of what they're doing that is not working so well?
Yeah, it's interesting. I always say you need a combination of what Biden did and Trump did. Like the fundamental problem with the US approach is it's gone from two extremes. So a lot of companies invested under Biden based on a certain set of policies that were supposed to last, and then Trump cancels them. So you just have no policy certainty because it's so it's swung so dramatically, and you know, they have completely different views on clean energy, which I just think is so fundamentally misplaced, because the biggest consensus in the US, bipartisan consensus, is on China. So you have this strange conundrum where they have a bipartisan consensus on competing with China, and Biden maintained a lot of Trump's tariffs from the first term, but they have completely different views on clean energy and energy in general, which completely undermines the objective of competing with China. And I say this because people just don't understand that an electric vehicle isn't just a political left-wing object to make people feel green or good, or is a whole load of Democrats who drive it. It's actually, the components are linked into a lot of other strategically industrially important things. So the rare earth magnets go in the motors, you know, the AI self-driving, but the battery technology, it's a big enough market to make a viable battery industry, which then you need batteries for data centers, for grids. So it's much more important than just satisfying left-wing drivers. It's about building all of these strategic industries, and that's the big failure of Trump, is in kind of damaging that industry.
Okay, I was thinking in the meantime, Trump has also decided to go on tariffs, you know, to put tariffs to a lot of countries, China too, of course, and China halted rare earth exports not to the US but also to other countries, and that is like weaponization of rare earths and their mineral dominance. Do you think that is interesting as a way of acting and reacting, or do you think it's just improvising, you know, in a situation that they were not expecting?
No, I think China's long prepared for it. And if you look at China, right back to when I was living in China, they've always used trade as a weapon. Like, I remember when I was in China, it was always something like someone's met with the Dalai Lama, or Japan's done something, or we saw it in COVID, Australia called for a COVID inquiry, and each time China punishes through trade. And if you look at Australia, they have always supplied minerals to China. They've never once used their minerals as any kind of weapon, pressure point. They've been a completely reliable supplier to enable the rise of China. Australia's completely enabled the rise of China. And China, on the other hand, has constantly used trade as a weapon. And rare earths goes back to Japan in 2010 when they stopped exports to Japan. So it was just a continuation of that. But I think what Trump did was kind of accelerate the direction China was going in and gave them this opportunity to use the leverage in the trade war. And it won, right? Let's face it, it won. Trump caved and gave in. And I think it was very successful.
In the end, do you think that Trump's approach has made the US more or less secure on its mineral supply chains, raw materials supply chains?
Yeah, it's a hard one. I think we're still too early to say, because some initiatives have been good, as I said, but some have been bad. So it's still too early to say, I think.
And there's also an oil comeback in the meantime that's happening. On one hand, because Trump has always believed in drilling, for example, but on the other hand, also what's happening in the world is making us weaker and weaker. And so we talked in this festival about sustainability and the green transition, and it's something that has taken a step back in this kind of times, because, you know, there are urgencies that are different and they are going and taking us a different way. So do you think it's a real comeback, or do you think that it will just go away when Trump goes away?
Yeah, I think, no, I don't think it's like the end of the energy transition or anything is dire like that. You know, there's a simple reason, which is China is the lion's share of energy demand. It's the lion's share of commodity demand. It's the lion's share of carbon emissions. It's the lion's share of all these things. So, and they are very committed to pushing forward with renewable energy. I think the biggest problem the world faces now is renewables have got cheap. The question is, how do you actually build grids based on renewables? So China's done the first part, which is make everything cheap. The real challenge is, how do you actually have an energy system that functions with renewables? And this is much more complex and much harder than many people realize. So even though the solar and batteries are getting cheaper, the cost of actually integrating everything is quite expensive. You need transmission, a lot more. Yeah, that's right. And even demand side. So in the UK where I live, you know, we have all this wind power in Scotland, but we waste so much of it and we pay it to turn off. We spend billions paying the wind power to turn off because we can't transmit it properly and use it properly. So to me, the country that can work out how to build a renewable-based system that can deliver cheap, available power successfully is gonna win, especially in you know, for data centers, for AI, and you know, China's doing a good job of getting there. It's you need a lot of different energy sources, and it's quite interesting in China. Hydropower is they've got a massive big target on hydropower, and people always neglect hydropower, but it's actually the biggest source of renewable energy in the world. It's also the oldest. The first hydropower plant came before the first coal-fired power plant, which is I really find really interesting. So you need lots of different sources, nuclear, obviously. So yeah, that's the challenge, is just building a grid off renewables, basically.
What do you think about what's Europe doing, if it's doing something, actually, on its rare earth materials? Like, does it have programs that are relevant in trying to have this kind of raw materials, or is it too dependent on other countries? And we know that usually it takes a long time for Europe to decide something and put something in action. How is it doing on this kind of stuff?
Yeah, good and bad. I think you know, so every mineral is different and has its own dynamics. But just taking rare earths, which I'm sure you all know, but these are quite niche minerals, and they're mostly used in these powerful magnets, electric vehicles and wind turbines, and a whole load of applications, scanner, defense. Europe has quite a lot of expertise, and in France there's quite interesting development. We have a lot of mic is breaking up.
You don't have to hold it on this. Okay, yeah.
And so France is actually building out rare earth processing, separation. In the UK, where I am, we have one of the only producers of rare earth metals outside of China. And they're also going to build a plant in Dunkirk in France. So we see the beginnings of a supply chain in Europe for separating and processing rare earths, which is the really hard thing. I think for Europe to actually have more mines is a much more difficult thing to achieve, because people just don't want mines. They take a long time. So Europe is trying to speed up permitting, and they have this Critical Raw Materials Act where they've tried to introduce permitting timelines. But you know, we're yet to see whether individual countries can actually speed up permitting despite the kind of EU aim. And I think new mines are just very, very complicated. I mean, when I went to the north of Sweden, they're trying to build a graphite mine, and they've agreed to not mine for, I think it's 6 months of the year, so the people with the reindeer herders can come down onto the land. I mean, that's just one complication. In Serbia, there was a huge backlash against lithium mine there, which eventually is not happening. So I think it's really difficult on the mining side, but I think on the rare earth processing, there's actually quite a lot of progress and quite a lot happening.
Serbia's case was quite interesting because Europe's, it seemed like it would do it, and I thought, well, we're doing something that's interesting. But then I saw the political reactions in the country, and they did not want that to be done at all, for also, green, sustainable reasons. Maybe they were right, but then I thought, well, we're not going to do something like ever. So that's the problem. Also, there's like the financial problem. Like someone has to put money on this kind of projects. Europe cannot do it on its own. I think there has to be like a private sector that's interested in financing this kind of stuff. And what's the situation there?
Yeah, so Europe's offered some money, but it's not really enough. I think a couple of $100 million. So it's not really enough to sort of catalyze a lot of investment, because these are cyclical industries. It's often private investors are not super interested in a lot of these niche minerals because China dominates them, et cetera, et cetera. So I think probably Europe, you need to decide, like, either you put a lot of money in, but it's very, very tricky because the US has gone down a route where the government's investing equity in mining companies and also has given some price guarantees, so a price floor, so a rare earth price floor, which sounds great, and it could work, but if prices fall dramatically below the price floor, the taxpayers paying, bailing out a private company. So it's a really difficult thing to actually structure, but we've seen US and Japan both do these price floors. So I think Europe is looking at that, and Europe's looking at stockpiling and other mechanisms, but it's just a very hard thing to get right because of the price volatility and the complexity of each mineral market, supply, demand, prices, etc. So it's very hard to get right. But even if we don't mine in Europe, the West has great allied mining countries like Australia, Canada. So it's not like we're not without support. And I think what Biden tried to do, and it was a very successful strategy, which is get all the allies together. You've got Australia for mining, you've got South Korea for processing, and try and build an allied supply chain. And that I think is the best strategy. And Trump is trying elements of it, but he's alienated so many allies that I think people just don't feel like joining hands with him. You had this bizarre scene where J.D. Vance got everyone to Washington and said, we need to create a critical minerals trade zone, which would have a price guarantee. And he said to the room, we need each other, we need you. But this was a week after they'd gone to Davos and alienated everyone. So it's difficult for me to see how they can actually embrace a more multilateral approach.
It's difficult to trust them at this point. And how are Australia and Canada moving? What are they getting right, and what are they doing? And why are they able to do that when we are not?
Yeah, I mean, these are just mining countries, so they've been doing it for a long time. They have the policies, the permitting in place. So these are the right places to do mines. I mean, obviously there are challenges in Canada with. There's always challenges, right, with these projects, and they take a long time. I think still the minimum time is sort of 15 years to get a mine up and running. So it still takes a long time, but it's much easier to do it in these countries. But where Australia has really struggled is when they move up the value chain to try and do processing, or try and do what China does really well. Actually, in something like lithium processing, I think they've shut down, or they're operating at half capacity. They've really struggled to sort of move up the value chain. So, because that's just not what Australia does, right? Australia mines, it doesn't produce batteries or cars or anything like that.
That's interesting, because I was thinking about Italy and like agriculture, but we became like really good, I think, at also processing food. And so that kind of product, because we had the product on our land. So it's kind of weird that countries that have those materials are not able to develop a value chain and actually work on those materials with activities that have a higher value than
Yes.
just getting them out, right?
Yes. No, it's really, so I always like to say, so the industries where China really dominates in these supply chains are the lowest margin, often very energy intense parts of the supply chain. So it's very hard to say to a company in America or Europe, do you want to go into an industry where the margins are low to not profitable? You've got
Need a big scale.
Yeah, you've got huge Chinese competition that could flood the market any time. And you have the energy cost thing, which is like in Europe is a huge challenge, because I was talking earlier, but a lot of these processes, people don't realize, require a lot of energy and heat. So lithium from Australia gets roasted in China to 1,000 degrees, multiple times before it's turned into battery materials. Then those battery materials need to be heated up again in big ovens to 1,000 degrees. So there's a lot of very energy intense steps that it's hard to see a lot of that happening in Europe in the current situation.
Do you think that in the end, the green transition kind of hired the level of our dependence on China and other countries, or were we dependent on other things before, and so nothing really changed?
No, massively. So we're in a situation now where, yes, clean energy is probably our only bet in Europe, because we don't have a huge amount of fossil fuels. I mean, yes, we have some gas we could restart, but...
You don't want nuclear power too?
Nuclear, I think it just takes time. That's the thing. Nuclear just takes time. So I think we are doing nuclear, and obviously there's small reactors we're looking at. But yes, absolutely, fundamentally, we are going to increase our reliance on China. And on the other hand, China's incentive for the world to make a green transition now is so massive. I can't stress this enough. They have built up so much production capacity. If the world doesn't buy these EVs and batteries, they are quite screwed. They're in a difficult situation. So they have such a big incentive now for the world to transition to EVs and clean energy. So I really think they're going to push that, which this Iran war could only accelerate that, right? And in the UK where I am, like, Chinese EVs are super popular. For instance, they've gone, one brand has gone, just launched at the beginning of last year, and it's already 2% of the market. And it took Hyundai 10, 15 years to do that, so they're moving super fast.
How did we not see this coming, and how has it happened that we were not prepared for this? Like, we just decided to go that way, knowing, or maybe not really knowing, what it meant. Because I was thinking about your book, The Winners and Losers in the Race to Go Green. We decided to take that road, and we had probably good reasons to do so, but how could we not know that the consequences were going to be the ones you just mentioned? The winners and losers are the ones we already talked about, I think, but if you want to expand that.
Yeah, it's a good question. So, the West, every clean energy technology was invented in the West, every single one, and this goes right back to nuclear power, hydropower, the first solar cell, the first lithium-ion battery. We were much earlier than China in terms of all these technologies. And actually, we did have manufacturing. So Germany really kickstarted the whole solar market by having these feed-in tariffs. And Germany was, at one point, I think, the biggest manufacturer of solar panels in the world. Europe's had a wind industry for decades before China. So we had a massive head start, I think, in the 90s, 2000s, or even going further back. But I think what we were naive about was the Chinese industrial policy and the aggressiveness of some of China's tactics. They really destroyed Germany's solar industry. Now they are challenging European wind turbine makers. In the UK government just stopped a Chinese wind company from building a factory in Scotland. So had to take strong action to stop it, but they're now really challenging European wind turbine companies, and they're 30% cheaper, I think, Chinese wind turbine. So right across the board, I think we've been naive about how aggressive China's industrial policy has been. And when I was in China, European companies and others were very naive about the Chinese market. So for instance, European wind companies kind of rushed into China. I think we gave them their first wind turbines in 1989. We thought
we exported our knowledge.
Yeah, that's right. We thought it was going to be a big market for us, and China turned around and introduced local content rules, took quite aggressive action. And today, you know, there's obviously not a big market for European wind companies. So I think we're completely right to do the same thing to China that they did, which is, and we've seen this industrial, the IAA Act in Europe, industrial, I can't remember what the full name is now, that's just been launched, which has like local content rules, restrictions, etc. And we can talk about that as well.
We can talk about that because some entrepreneurs were mentioning this local content to me yesterday in another event, and they were praising actually this kind of intention, but also that they were saying that in some sectors we actually have the strength to produce what we need. In some others we have some dependencies that are not so easily switched. So it's almost like Trump that wants to bring back some manufacturers to the country, but they do not have the knowledge and capacity and people to do that. So what do you think?
Yeah, I think from what I've read of this IAA, Industrial Accelerator Act, it seems really good intention, but there are just what I've read is there's loopholes, you know, about, you know, if the product's like 20 or 30% cheaper and things, there's various loopholes that I think people are complaining about, saying, well, actually, China can exploit these loopholes. And this goes back to another problem, which is we can have all these regulations, but China's very good at getting through loopholes. And we saw under Biden, he had these foreign entity of concern provisions, so you couldn't have a Chinese company and get the tax credits. And basically what China did was build plants in Morocco, Indonesia. So I'll give you a classic example, right? So Trump put tariffs on graphite, which is a material used in batteries. And all that happened when I looked at the data was all the imports into the US came from a Chinese company in Indonesia. So, you know, and we saw it with solar in Europe as well. So they're very good at getting around tariffs and other policies. So it makes it super hard to have policies without loopholes.
How do you think China's actually doing on the economic side? Because you mentioned that it's really hard to actually hit the Chinese model and weaken it, but also at the same time some signals are coming through of China's living in a difficult time. Do you think that's true? How are they doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's like the $1 million question, right? And I think it's really hard to know. I think the GDP figures just came out. You know, I don't think we should think of China as like some amazing fortress that has no problems. It has a huge amount of problems, and I think the Communist Party would be the first to admit, right? They have huge youth unemployment, aging population. It's got a huge amount of problems. Property market is weak, and just this basic problem of not having enough consumption, right? And people over saving. They haven't seemed, I'm not an economist, but you know, everyone's been saying you've got to boost consumption, and they just still haven't done it successfully or reluctant to do it successfully. So yeah, they've got a huge amount of problems. And as I've said, they've built up so much production capacity, they have to export so much. That, you know, the really interesting thing to me is not just a pushback in the US, but other developing countries like Brazil put tariffs on Chinese EVs, Mexico. You know, is there going to be pushback from the whole world against China's export practices? And that's really interesting to see, especially in the global South, because it always thinks of itself as belonging to the global South or part of the developing world.
I was also thinking about something that you mentioned, the prices that go up and down a lot. They're really volatile. And what are the problems of that? The reasons, I think, are some of those that you already mentioned, but yeah, the financial side of these materials is wild right now, and that has consequences, I think, on industries, right?
Yeah, so when you look at raw material prices, it's super interesting because you have all these futures markets in China that most people don't know about, but there's futures for everything, like rubber, all these commodities, and they're very, very liquid and well traded. And Chinese just love speculation and speculative trading. So you have a huge amount of trading activity in China on iron ore, lithium, all these different futures, more retail trading than you would in the West. Like we don't go out and trade London Metal Exchange futures, but in China there's a huge amount of trading. So it can be very, very volatile.
So there's speculation behind it.
Yeah, so it can be very, very volatile. And so the other question for the West is a lot of the pricing is done in China. So they have an ambition, and they've succeeded in some ways to dominate commodity pricing. So setting the price for these commodities, even because obviously in oil they don't these things, but these metals and minerals, they are big players, and they're kind of the price setters, and the price is increasingly set in China. So the West needs to work out. This is a really interesting topic, but if you're fragmenting supply chains, you potentially need another price outside China to reflect that market. And we're starting to see the beginning of that, but in a very sort of nascent way.
That's actually very interesting because, if you want to not rely totally on China, you have also to make your prices. Do you think that could actually happen? And what are the steps that take us there?
Yeah, so you basically need more demand. You need to build up these industries, these supply chains, and then you need more trading, more traders. But eventually you could get there. And you're starting to see, as I say, like some nascent efforts, but there's not much liquidity. Because, if you look at demand, China's still 2/3 of electric vehicle demand. It's most of the demand for these commodities. That's the issue.
Something that I think is happening here in Italy, I don't know much, but I've heard people talk about recycling, these kind of like batteries, for example. Someone yesterday was talking about how we import batteries and we look at that negatively, but also at the same time, we don't realize that importing batteries, if we can recycle them, makes us stronger. It means we're not just importing batteries, but also materials that we can reuse. Do you think that's a way to go around the topics that we talked about and the dependence?
Yeah. No, I think we should do recycling, and it's one option. And for something like lead, I think there's like almost 100% recycling rate. So we have been very successful, aluminium recycling, etc. But the issue is that it's not a solution, because it's a very challenging business, right? Because margins are very low, because you're kind of squeezed between the material you can get to recycle and then the prices that you have to sell at, and you're very kind of squeezed between 2 points. So we've seen a lot of bankruptcies in recycling companies. It's very, very challenging. But the other issue is that batteries are lasting a very long time. And also those electric vehicles might be exported. So old EVs are exported to Ukraine. And certainly before the war, a lot of old EVs went to Ukraine. So, but one thing Europe's done is introduce tighter legislation on keeping waste materials within the EU, which is good, because it's good and bad, but a lot of material used to go to Asia to be recycled. But it's a challenging business because, who pays the most for the waste material can kind of get that waste material. And so I think is one option, and perhaps in rare earths it can also be successful because we have a lot of things we can recycle, but it's not the panacea. It shouldn't be something that we in Europe should throw, like we're going to, like, as you said, like get around the issue. You're still going to need a lot of mined material first, or alongside recycling. But China is interesting. A lot of recycling happens in China, and they're starting to get a lot of lithium from recycling, a lot of other metals. So yeah, for sure, it's part of longer term, if you think where we want to go, 2050 beyond, yeah, we could have much more closed loop supply chains.
So also waste is a topic, I think, because if we're starting to recycle now, that means that up until now we just wasted everything that was productive, like batteries. Where did they go before?
Yeah, I think, nothing. I don't think anything. I think there's a myth like they got wasted or chucked away. They're big supply chains, and mostly just get exported to Asia to be recycled. But it does always end up being recycled.
Okay, I'll ask the public if they have some questions.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Se ci sono delle domande, vi portano il microfono, un secondo solo. Sì, arriva. Vi portano il microfono così ci sentono tutti. Alzate meglio la mano così vi vede. Grazie mille. Se avete per caso necessità di farlo in italiano, poi la traduciamo.
Sì. Hi. So we have a big group here from Romania. About 20 years ago, a Canadian company, Roșia Montana Gold Corporation. Do you know the story a little bit? Oh, okay. Well, I thought of asking you about this situation. So they started 20 years ago in the west of Romania. These are some Roman ancient time gold mines that have been shut down over the time. And they wanted to dig open air with all the pollution on the site. I mean, with a big lake where they would reverse all the waste. It was 10. Well, their advancement was pretty fast. But 10 years ago, a massive protest all over the country. We also participated, and it was blocked. But now in the Trump era, we fear this may reopen. Now I'm going to rephrase the question. Do you think all over the world, such examples like the one you had in Serbia, which I didn't know about, may resurface and may be seen in a different way? Maybe the public here will kind of say, well, it's a bad job, but if we have to do it in order for the planet to go further, then we'll have to compromise. Do you think you have such examples in the world where these polluting activities may resurface, or maybe we already have the technology to be more clean in processing all that?
Yeah, it's a good question. For sure, we're seeing a lot of mines resurface as prices go up or demand increases, and I think that Trump is trying to boost permitting, reduce kind of environmental, but there's only so far he can go in the US, right? They still have their laws and regulations. There's only so much he can do, and in fact, I don't think the permitting bill has actually passed in the US. So I think he's trying, but there's only so much they can do. I think globally, from people I've talked to, what they say is the mining industry used to use the argument to local people that we need this for the green transition, and that hasn't worked, according to the main lobby group for mining. So they try a different approach now. They don't say that. So yeah, it's interesting that angle hasn't worked. People don't buy into that. So I think that there is not necessarily a narrative that people will agree to. People just don't want mines, right? I don't think that problem's been solved. Now, are there cleaner ways of doing it? Yeah, there are. And what's really interesting in South America is Chile, under the previous president, young guy, mandated that the lithium companies, well, so he did two things. The state took a greater role in the lithium companies, but mandated they use a new type of technology called direct lithium extraction, where you basically don't have to have big evaporation pools in the Atacama Desert, and you don't need to potentially pump so much brine, evaporate the brine, because there are a lot of concerns about use of water in the Atacama Desert. So that's an example of new technology coming in that could be less intensive on the environment. And I think it got agreement from people in Chile to go through that. So there are promises, but one interesting thing that's happened is something like nickel. Chinese went into Indonesia and invested billions in nickel processing in Indonesia. And as a result, the more sustainable operations in Australia have gone bankrupt and shut production. So, that's kind of a backward step. But yeah, the fundamental problem of protest, of not wanting mines, I don't think has been solved. I can't think of any examples of new projects that have come up. A lot of Trump's focus has been on Africa, like we talked about, and in the DRC, trying to get them to give some mines, building this Lobito corridor, which would take minerals towards the west coast. So yeah, a lot of focus on Africa.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
Hi. Sort of adding on to the topic of not wanting mines, I was wondering if countries such as Zimbabwe, who are demanding more manufacturing in their own country, are trying to shift into the secondary sector more to maybe replace some of the income of their primary sector, if they're trying to reduce some stress on their landscape, for example, to not have to take full advantage of it, or if they're maybe trying to make the best of both worlds and really want to get both, or if they're trying to replace one a little bit.
Yes, I think what they're doing is quite clever, which is they're not trying to do that. They're not trying to move into like battery manufacturing or go too far up the supply chain. What they're saying to Chinese is just go one step further up and produce an intermediate chemical called lithium sulfate rather than exporting. So they were exporting a rock with about 5-6% lithium, and lithium sulfate has much more, and the price is much higher. So I think it's a good strategy, because it's just that much further up the supply chain that's achievable to do. We've seen countries like Chile. Chile offered to give cheaper lithium to companies who would build processing or batteries in Chile, and it's just never succeeded. And it's a developed country, so the idea that African countries could get a lot of industry, I think, is not that realistic. So I think Zimbabwe has been realistic, just saying let's just have a bit more value in country. But you hear stories of African countries wanting battery manufacturing or electric vehicle manufacturing. I just think it's not realistic. So yeah, that would be my.
Thank you. There was one here.
Okay, hello. We talked about the Africa that is a home of raw materials, and you've told again that it's not realistic to have manufacturing there. Do you think if in future we can try to help them evolve and to have a better standard living?
Yeah, of course. There are things you could do, but it's interesting. If 10, 15 years ago, when I was in China, there was a belief that maybe Africa could then do manufacturing. And I remember visiting Ethiopia and seeing the Chinese had come and built sort of leather factories, shoe factories, and there was a lot of hope that Africa could move into manufacturing. But I just don't think it's been that successful. But in saying that, as I said with Zimbabwe, like if you're, rather than just exporting a mined mineral, you can go just a bit further up the value chain, and the price difference is quite stark. You can make a lot more money in country just by going like one step up the value chain. But energy is another interesting angle. So DRC has hydropower potential, a lot of good electricity potential. So that in turn could attract industry if you build the infrastructure, etc. But as I say, I think just going one step further up can bring a lot of additional benefit. I think even in Europe, trying to be too ambitious is a recipe for failure. And we saw this in Sweden, where this battery company, Northvolt, wanted to do everything, right? And it looked great. And I remember I loved it. It was a great presentation, great story, great founder. Investors loved it, but they tried to do everything. And I just don't think that's like a good strategy. Just try and do something small first.
Thank you. There was another question.
Hi. You talked about China a lot and them depending so much on raw materials from other countries to produce all of their technologies. Recently, I've been reading about deep sea mining and China leading a lot of the explorations. Do you think that's going to change how they work, as even put them in a higher position, since they will no longer be relying too much on other countries exporting the raw materials, but China importing, getting those materials from the ocean? And wouldn't that be more controversial for them, meaning that other companies or internationally, they will be more like they wouldn't want to because it's damaging the environment?
Yeah, so deep sea mining is a really interesting topic. So again, the Trump administration, so the international waters are supposed to be governed by the International Seabed Authority for the benefit of the whole mankind. And they just haven't come up with an agreement for deep sea mining. And the Trump administration just went ahead anyway and said deep sea mining could take place. Under the International Seabed Authority, China does have the most licenses for exploration. So for sure, they're interested. But they just don't seem to come to an agreement because there are all sorts of complexities, such as you have to compensate mineral-rich countries for any impact from deep sea mining. So I think it's just fiendishly complex to work out a solution for everyone. At the same time, many Western companies, are calling for moratorium or don't really agree with it because of the destruction to habitats. Like, we don't even fully know what's down there, let alone what the impact of deep sea mining is going to be. But there's a lot of work going on and studies. But I just question whether we really need it, to be honest. So the progress of technology and mineral development is a very, very complicated one. And that is very, very hard to forecast, extremely hard to forecast. So, for instance, battery technology, like, where is battery technology going to be in 10 years? I honestly believe no one has a clue. Like, it's incredibly difficult to forecast. Over the last 10 years, there's been a revolution in battery technology where 80% of the batteries in Chinese electric vehicles now don't use nickel and cobalt. So it's already changed in the space of like five years. So what is it going to be in 10 years' time? It's extremely hard to say that we're going to need these minerals from the deep sea, because also you've got recycling coming on, etc. So I don't really know if we need it, to be honest. But Japan's looking at it for rare earths. Everyone's looking at it. Yeah, so let's see.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Okay, I think we've answered to all the curiosities we could have about this topic. Thank you very much, Henry Sanderson. Thank you for being here and listening to us on a Saturday afternoon. It's been very interesting, I hope for you too. And thank you. Until the next time.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank
Thank you.
Italian.